Welcome to In the Ven Zone with Christine McKay, where we get candid about what it takes to negotiate effectively. You'll learn from the challenges and successes of entrepreneurs, executives, and experts. We help you change the nature of your negotiations and get more from every deal you do.
Welcome back, everyone, to In the Ven Zone, where we are dedicated to helping you, the small business owners, level up your negotiation and change the nature of your negotiation. We are here to help you level your playing fields and find solutions to challenging and interesting conversations that you may be having with, whether it's with your customers, your suppliers, your investors, or even your employees. And actually, to be honest, a lot of times it's even with yourself. So welcome, and we're so glad to have you spending your time with us. And today, as I am always excited about my guests, because I love learning from my guests, it's one of the highlights of doing podcasting, I swear. We have Livia Jenvey with us today, and Livia has more than 20 years of experience in operational excellence, and she has done work across the board for corporations, small businesses, founders, working with C-suite executives, the whole gamut. And she has her own firm, Jenvey Consulting. And one of the reasons why I wanted to bring her on the show is because she's seeing an interesting trend in her work around a lot of businesses starting to think, especially in part because of what we're experiencing with COVID-19, is around exit planning. And as some of you who have listened, and many of you have been listening to me before, I often talk about what our exit strategies are. Actually, do that, those things influence our negotiation strategy. If you're going to pass your company on to your family or somebody in your family, that drives a certain type of thing, a certain type of behavior that you want in your contracting and your negotiation. If you're going to sell it to a larger organization, that drives a different type of behavior and different types of things that you want in your contracts, et cetera, et cetera. So Livia, thank you so much for being here. Really excited to have you here. It's awesome to see you.
Thank you, Christine. I'm so honored to be here to do this podcast with you.
Awesome. So tell us a little bit about your journey. How did you get to where you're at today? And tell us more about what you're doing.
So my journey, I started off working in the world. I actually was part of the early .com world back in the day. So working in companies, doing a lot of, the nuts and bolts, doing all that type of stuff. When you were in the .com, you wore many hats. And so then I moved into working. Yes, definitely. We all did back in the day. And then I moved into working into the world of consulting and then working with clients, a lot of big public firms, Fortune 500, Fortune 100 companies, helping them with their operations to really figure out what issues they were having operational wise that were causing them to lose a lot of money. And it would be either just in organizations, departments, even across the board throughout the whole company as well. Then I moved into started working with companies that were more in the private sector. And it was a really different dichotomy to see based on how the public companies operate and the private companies operate, and how that there were certain things that the private companies that were doing that was really impacting how they operated successfully. It was reducing how they were actually making money to their bottom line. And that was a huge, huge problem when owners in these private held companies were looking to exit. And they didn't realize that there's a lot of how you operate will affect the end result of the type of exits that you decide to have, and also how much money you end up getting out of the exit as well. And so one of the things that I do a lot of work in, and it was interesting before COVID, didn't really talk a lot about exit planning. We kind of had to sort of negotiate the way we verbiage that and talking about that in the way the work that I do and the services in my company. But now post-COVID, we see a lot of clients coming to us directly to look into how to exit, because what I've found is that within the private sector, either they're a family-owned business or they're a business that, they're a small group of entrepreneurs, they've been running it for a while. They're very enmeshed in how it operates day to day. And it's trying to figure out how to shift on how you operate, how to be able to give yourself an operational excellence that's really unique to your business, that actually increases the value of the company and gives you options for your exit. Because that's where I found with a lot of companies is that their operations is actually stopping them to have various negotiations that are more in their favor for when they
Mhm.
decide to finally exit a company.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Give us an example, of course, confidentially, but I'd love to hear more about that.
So one example was a client I worked with. They were three owners. They owned the company for many, many years. They were ready to basically exit the company. They were not going to be giving it to family. They decided that they wanted to sell it to a third party.
Mhm.
Well, they went out to the third party and presented the company saying, "Hey, we've been making, all this money. We've got great products." And they looked like from an outside point of view, they looked like a really good potential buy for this third party. Well, the thing is that when the third party comes in, they start doing their due diligence of
Mhm.
how does the business really operate. And what they found is that the way the business operated was actually bleeding money compared to what they were making in revenue.
Mm.
And the third party said, "We are willing to buy your company. However, we need you to fix how you're operating." And also, they weren't going to give them the highest value of dollar amount that they originally wanted.
Mm.
So they lost in that negotiation to sell that company to that third party.
Oh gosh, I see that stuff happen all the time. So, as you and I have talked before, I've worked in the mergers, acquisitions, and divestiture space a lot, and I actually started my career in that world. And it is exacerbating to see companies who appear to be really good companies, and they've got these great revenue deals, and sometimes they're not very well contracted, which that impacts your ability to get a higher selling price if you don't have solid contracts, with respect to, especially to your key customers. But then what ends up happening is a lot of smaller businesses get so enamored with the revenue number that they completely fail to observe that their profitability is taking a hit. I know that's one of the things that I focus a lot on whenever I'm negotiating. It's like, we're not talking revenue, we're talking profit. And if you're losing profit on a customer, you need a different customer. You need to find different places that you're better off not having that revenue at all than taking that revenue at a loss. And so how have you, like, when you're in that situation, right? Because the other part is, in small businesses, it's their baby, right? It's like they put their blood, sweat, tears, some people have lost marriages, lost homes, like it is like an all in thing. How do you negotiate with your clients in that situation when they have an exit plan or they've come up with one and it's just not unfolding the way that they envision it?
Well, often what I find is that with the clients I work with, their exit plan is more or less in their head as
Mhm.
opposed to it as a realistic plan.
Mm.
And also, what I tend to find as well is that there's so much in how they're operating
Mhm.
that is so passionate based that they tend to forget that there's certain ways that they need to take some of that passion out and focus more on the structure of how things are operating. And what I find very often is a lot of work that we do is that, a lot of companies, they don't have time to do any sort of documentation of what they do
Mhm.
because it's hard. You're an entrepreneur, you're running a business for many years. You don't have time to sit around and document what you do every day. Like, really?
Mhm.
Like, I got to fight fires. I got to deal with payroll. I got to deal with getting a new customer. I got to
Right.
negotiate this. I got to deal with my suppliers. But those are things that when they look at exiting, um, it's whoever's taking over a company, and it doesn't have to be a third party. It could be the management team taking over. It could be the
Mhm.
family members taking over. It needs to be transferable, and it needs to be done in a way that's simple and easy for whoever's taking over to learn how to operate it day to day without any
Mm.
hiccups. And
Mhm.
so what tends to happen, what I've found in my experience, is that there's an idea of where the owners want to take the company, but they don't have a clear definition of like that, how to plan that out, how long they plan to be there. They
Mhm.
don't have a clear understanding of exactly like especially when they're transferring it to a management team or their kids.
Mhm.
Clear example of understanding like if they're the right people to even take over the role. and be able to manage it.
Yeah.
And then also there's the negotiation between those who are taking it over. Are they going to be performing it and doing it the same way that you've been doing it? And are you okay if they change things around?
Mm.
And there definitely has to be a lot of what I find is that it's just how you operate day to day. If you're used to doing it every single day, it's easy to do. But can
Mhm.
you really like teach others to do the same, or can they just easily like pick up and get it going to do it? And so that's where the biggest challenge is that I see that I find with a lot of the clients I work with.
Mhm.
And some of them, they have a plan, and as soon as we go through the details, they realize that plan is not realistic.
Ah, okay.
So we have to then negotiate with them of what's really a plan that's going to make your end goal realistic based
Mhm.
on what you're looking to do.
Mm. What drives the lack of realism, do you think, in that plan?
I think one of the biggest things I find that's the biggest difference with a lot of businesses who are not focused on like IPOing
Mhm.
is that when you are a
And
business
by
who,
by the way, for those who don't know what that is, that's an initial public offering. So that means they're going. So if somebody is going to go do an IPO, they're going to the stock market. We just have a wide variety of listeners, and I always want to explain the acronyms to people.
yeah, no
so
problem.
so everybody who didn't know, now you know what an IPO is. So
Yeah. So
sorry
if
about
you're
that.
if you're a company who is a private company and your goal is to become like the next Facebook and go and make uber billions of dollars on the stock market, you have to plan an exit strategy at the start
Hmm.
because you're getting involved with investors, you're getting involved with folks who are going to be like, we're going to invest some money in your company, but I want to know how long it's going to be until I get my money back and my interest or whatever, whatnot.
Hmm.
Well, with what I found is that with privately held companies who have no intention of doing that, they really don't have a clear exit strategy when they first start.
Hmm.
And often what happens is that owners who are considering some sort of succession plan, it isn't really until they're just exhausted.
That's not a good indicator, right? Because if you're exhausted, then you're emotionally frayed. And so one of the things that I talk about a lot, especially in negotiations, whoever's the most emotional at the proverbial negotiation table is the one who walks away with the least. It gets the least of what they want, because emotion, even though in negotiation is inherently emotional and we are emotional creatures, the reality is it's the person who can control the emotion at the table. And if you're exhausted, like on a level, then your ability to do that is significantly impacted, and it'll be easy for somebody to take advantage of you in that situation if you're not aware.
Which to that point, that's why the statistics out there is really scary, where a majority of owners, about, I want to say like 70 to 80% who try to sell their company end up making not anywhere close to what they want to, and that end up selling. Only about 20% actually make a successful transition, and if they're selling a company, really get what they're looking for.
Oh, wow. So is that in part because, so part of that, as we're talking about, is kind of this lack of foresight in terms of what a succession plan is going to look like, or what the exit is going to look like. How is that going to unfold, and doing the things they need to do to prepare for it, right? Because even if you're selling as a private company, if you're selling to another private company, you still need to be able to produce audited financials. You've got to have processes. You may have to, depending on the size of the company, you may have to have a level of risk management that's in place. And there are a lot of controls, operating controls, that you have to have in place. I was just talking to somebody else on the who I interviewed. I just won't say who it was, but this person acquired a company, and it was operating in multiple states, and what they bought was not what they thought they were getting. And they were, on the flip side, they are, I mean, they've had the business for a while now, but they felt duped by that business. So it probably was one of the 20% who that was able to get the value that they wanted because they had a buyer that wasn't an informed buyer. So if you don't have all the things in place, you might be able to do that, but for the majority, that doesn't work. And then in addition, over 70% of acquisitions flop anyway.
Yeah.
Okay.
So for an owner who's looking to, they're at the end of their ropes, right? They've been working 40 hours a day, it feels like, in a business for, many years, some for decades. They don't have a strategy in place. It's forcing them to have a strategy in place. The thing is that within a company, you have a high likelihood of it going out of business because of either, a disability, a death, a divorce, a disagreement, or any of these big things that can happen to us every single day. Your company has a 50% chance of being, negatively impacted by those things every single day. And so that's sort of where, getting back to that question you were asking about, like, why does owners not think about it? It gets into sort of like, when I work with privately held companies, like, they started this business because it was something they were very passionate about, either a particular type of product that they just saw they really, really enjoyed and saw the need and saw the desire of folks to purchase it. And they were just, they really love and enjoy what they do. And they tend to more or less focus on, like, sort of the impact, I want to say, of like what they're sharing to the world. And so when it comes to working on them on an operational plan that's related to how they're looking to succeed and exit out of a business, it gets into that emotional state of like, you're not going to be doing this thing you've been super excited and passionate about for all these years. And so usually what I do, and a lot of the work I do, is I really base it on the risk, because that's really the most fundamental thing that I'm looking to resolve very quickly in how a business operates. Not only if they're looking at, just how to shift things around today because they're looking to, work with new partners, but it's also just, there's a very high risk in how you operate if you don't have a clear succession plan in place. And it's not a plan you need to like engage in right away, but it is something to help remove that risk out of the company. And it also helps you negotiate how you exit. And that's sort of where I find is that taking the time to really create that operational plan that's related to how you would succeed the business gives owners so much more power in how they negotiate. I've seen owners who have a plan who are like, well, you know what? I was thinking of selling the company maybe 10 years. I still got another 10 years to go. It's totally good. We help them create their plan and they're like, I can do it in 5 years if I want. Right.
Yeah.
And they didn't realize they had that ability. And then when they start to negotiate with whoever they're thinking of taking over the company, they have stronger negotiation leverage. They can say like, you know what, I decide to, sell the company in 5 years, but I maybe want to stay on as like a consultant for a couple of years. They have that ability to do that. But the thing is, I find is that when you don't have that in place, your ability to go to the negotiation table, it's you give the power to the other person.
So we talk a lot about that in our training programs, and huge believer in the need to have clarity before you go into the negotiation. Clarity in what it is that you want and how important are those things to you, because those become the nexus of your entire negotiation position, right? And knowing all of the possibilities related to those things is equally important, because it's the possibilities that that your counterpart is trying to buy into, right? And so you want to know what's important or what's possible for the counterpart so you can figure out what your trade-offs are. So I love that you said that, because it's very easy for people, I think, to wrap their head around kind of, oh, I want clarity on this little thing, this product that I'm buying. I know exactly how I want this product to work. I know exactly what kind of customer service I want. But when you start like extrapolating that into this much bigger thing in terms of buying companies, a lot of people have a harder time wrapping their head. And I can tell you, I've done, like I said, I've done a lot of acquisitions and divestiture work, and I've done my largest deal was $2.4 billion. And so it's like that, but the thing is that the process, the importance of having that operational plan, knowing what that exit is going to look like. If you're doing transition services agreements, which are very common in acquisition situations with an existing company, where they're going to bring the company they're buying underneath their operating umbrella. You have a transition services agreement. Oh my God, I've seen so many of those negotiated so poorly that it leaves unexpected cost, either with the seller if they didn't plan that right, or with the buyer if they didn't negotiate effectively. Do you do very much work in the transition services and that component of things?
I like to joke around and say that it's like you are now a new family with new stepkids. And so it's like the Brady Bunch. So it's kind of like getting the Bradys all together to work succinctly and on how they operate. I definitely see that a lot. I've seen companies I worked with where they bought another company because it was a good, they were like a mini competitor. They actually had some really good products. They brought them on in, but the operations for that other company was just baffling. And the way that it could meld into the current company, it wasn't possible. So it was figuring out how to, see what would meld in together, see how they would, had to shift it around, because it's how I think one of the biggest things is that where I find is that because owners are busy in the weeds of the day-to-day operation, it's very difficult to step away and see what's going on around you. And when you're in the midst of like negotiating with buying another company, there's certain due diligence that needs to be a little bit extra done in the other company's operation that I think certain companies don't necessarily look into. Because partially they don't have clear of how their operations is set up and how to really match those two together, or figure out ways how they can shift things around on both sides so they can really mesh together. They tend to be more focused on like, that product is great and that product is exactly what I need. But it was like, but if they're producing that product, is the way they're producing it actually going to be easy for you to take on?
Yeah, I love that. So my last company also had been a client, and then I started working for them. And it was a fascinating situation because it was a carve out from a large technology company, and it was a product line carve out, acquired, oddly, by a private equity firm. No operations went with this product line at all. We had to stand up everything from CRM to manufacturing and distribution, and no contracts came over. So we had to renegotiate all the contracts. And that was my role. That's what I did there, is I renegotiated the major customer and suppliers, some of the distribution agreements and stuff. And it was insane. And I was like, and the transition services agreement was just horrible. And it's like, oh my gosh, and it pained me. And it pained me. And it is, what was especially painful was when, the private equity guys, one of them in particular, he just thinks he's the greatest negotiator since sliced bread. And I'm like, oh, dude, no. I kept looking at this damn agreement and I'm going, this is a nightmare. And they spent so much more money than they ever needed to, because they had not planned that appropriately. It was not effective. It was not an effective a deal for them.
I would say contract negotiations and contract agreements with other companies need to be very vetted before you looking to buy on another product for that company, because that is the biggest area that I find is where there's the hugest risk when you're doing that. Because there's, for example, if you're buying another product in a company and they have certain contracts with other like distributors or warehouses, that may be only for them. So they could be loyal to them. And then when you buy them on, they then become your competitor. And I've seen that happen as well, because that's where it's more of like, that's where I find that like there needs to be more of a shift in companies to not only think of like in the private sector just revenue focused, it needs to be bottom line revenue focused. And when it's
Absolutely.
bottom line revenue focused, that includes everything from like
Right.
your day-to-day operations to the type of contracts you have, the type of supply chain suppliers you're working with, the warehouses, what kind of technology. I've seen where they've bought companies and the technology for the old one was just super new,
Mhm.
and their current one was not at all. And there was
Right.
no way to mesh those two together. And they had tried to figure out ways to like duct tape things. And that was causing a huge risk because they were actually losing a lot of money
Mhm.
because things weren't being tracked correctly, operation from end to end.
Yeah. So I absolutely, I see that all the time. Right. So and that's something that I get frustrated with people. And yes, that is the right term. Because, and I see it especially in small businesses, and it's one of the reasons why I love the work that I do, because smaller companies will often abdicate their contracts to their lawyers. And a lot of times, lawyers are not knowledgeable about the business, like the core business, right? Now, there's some industries, like in the entertainment industry, I have to say that entertainment attorneys, they define the business, they know the business.
Mm-hmm.
But and you do get specialists in every industry, absolutely. So this is not a blanket statement, but a lot of small companies use more generalized attorneys to do their business, and those lawyers are not steeped in the different risks related to operating that business from an operational perspective, right? So things around, I was just having this conversation yesterday, things around distribution, right? Well, many attorneys and attorneys I've worked with in companies, they'll go, oh, well, we covered distribution risk. We'll deal with a rep and a warranty, and we'll do it. And I'm like, what's the return rate? How's inventory get held? When does inventory get shipped? Who is it? Is it freight on board? Who owns it while it's in the transit process? Who has to do what at customs? All these little things are operational. And I had a conversation when I was working with one of my clients. We were negotiating with a really large telecommunication company, and they had I want to say it was like 3 or 4 pages, this was a couple of years ago, of language around how you do background checks, how you do drug testing. It was applicable. The way the contract language was worded is that anything that you were obligated to do, every one of your suppliers was obligated to do. And I sat down with the head of HR and I said, what kind of testing do we do? We don't do any. Do we do these things in background checks? Why do you need to know that? This is in the contract. What do you mean this is in the contract? I said, this is in every major corporation's contract. This kind of language is very common. It's very standard. In her over 20 years of working in the tech space in HR, nobody had ever told her that there were operational implications to her HR department based on the contract language for various customers. And I imagine you see that all the time, because the operational risk is huge in a lot of these contracts. And so yet so many business owners and smaller businesses abdicate that to the attorney, and the attorney won't even know that operational risk exists, and the business won't have paid attention to it.
In regards to that, I think one of the biggest things I've seen is that when it comes to operational, like having the right forms in place, having the right type of signature in place, having the right types of like insurances in place, safeguards in place, contracts in place, that is where I find that operational wise, a lot of private small businesses are lacking, even if they've been in business for over 30 years. They really have issues where I find that like certain companies that want to do deals with a bigger public company, they end up losing those deals because they don't have those operational contracts in place.
Mm-hmm.
Because the good and bad I find with small business owners is that they actually have a higher tolerance of risk. It's sort of
Yes.
why they decided to become business owners themselves instead of working for someone else. They were like, I'm okay with this high level of risk. I'm going to start my company and move that forward. Which, okay, that could be good within the first 5 years where you're kind of like getting out there trying to develop things, but you need to very quickly, even very beginning, get in the right type of contracts negotiated right in place. And then on an ongoing basis, as your company grows and expands and shifts and changes, or whatever new products or distributors or connections that you have or partners, you need to have more contracts in place to protect your business. And
Mhm.
that's where I find that I agree with you. I find like there's definitely, when it comes to small businesses, they don't have an in-house counsel, which is one biggest challenge. Because if they had an in-house counsel, they might be able to have someone more dedicated on like how to operate day to day, what to look out for some of the contracts.
Mhm.
But also at the same time, it's also being aware that how to prevent yourself from having higher risk with
Mhm.
these things that are you're going to start to have negotiations with. That is where I find that where I have to do negotiation and working with the owners I work with, because I'm
Mhm.
helping them first and foremost, let's reduce this risk in your company. If that means that we need to get in someone like yourself, Christine, to help do these negotiated contracts that are better for the company, we need to do this ASAP, because this is what is causing your bottom line revenue to
Mhm.
actually be way, way lower than your actual revenue value is. And that's one of the biggest things that when I start working with a client is really helping them understand the difference between the top line and the bottom line revenue, because they're really focused on the top line revenue, which is great. But if your bottom line revenue is not a good one, it is
Mhm.
really due to how your operations is running.
Mhm.
It's usually because there's some high risk in how your operation is running that needs to figure out how to solve those problems and how to be able to negotiate with those involved to make sure that you remove that risk as soon as possible.
So one of the things that I see a lot, and this frustrates, especially when I'm negotiating, because I like David and Goliath negotiations. So I enjoy helping smaller organizations kind of level the playing field a little bit more with respect to large company negotiations. But one of the things that, and I worked for years with procurement departments in big companies, and I frustrate them now because one of my things is I won't talk price right away, because a big company has lots, like it's another telco. It's not in the United States. And I was negotiating a contract with them, hundreds of pages long. To be honest, this contract took over 3 years to negotiate. It was massive. And but they had an entire operating manual that was appended to the contract. So it became part of the contract. So whatever was in it, you were contractually obligated to perform. And it's like people don't look at those things, and they don't see all the costs. Everything from, and you'll appreciate this, everything from the box has to be this size, the label has to be put in this corner, the label has to be, the barcode has to be on top, the address has to be this way, you have to have this much tape on it, it has to be taped here, it has to be, I mean, it's just like, it gets crazy, the operational implications of this. And smaller companies don't have the capacity to adhere to some of those things, but in the desire to get revenue, if they got to get revenue, they'll take those deals and not acknowledge how expensive those people are, those customers are to service. And it creates a huge problem for them. So, from a gross margin perspective, or as you're using bottom line revenue, you squeeze yourself, and your ability to recover from that is really limited once you get into that cycle, because a big company can eat you alive if you are not prepared. And so, getting a big account by luck or, even if it's not luck because you've worked your butt off to get it. But if you're not prepared, if you don't have the processes and the systems in place to actually service that account, you're going to be behind the 8 ball all the time. You will never be able to catch up because they will just continue to demand more and more and more. And I hate to break it to you, but for most of us, their switching costs are pretty low, and their ability to find a replacement for you as a supplier is pretty easy. It's pretty easy.
I see it a lot. I see a company very often see a big client, big public company, and they're just like, we will bend over backwards to get this account. It's going to be, to have this brand name company as one of our top clients is like, but at the end, the smaller company is eating. They're not making any revenue out of it. They're really eating it, and they're basically paying that company to use their logo for advertisement. It's really what it comes down to.
And to be honest, that's actually very rare. Most large companies, most Fortune 500s will not let you use their logo. They guard that because that's their intellectual property. It's their goodwill on their balance sheet, right? And they protect that very carefully. So if you are fortunate enough to get the coveted right to put their logo, a big company logo on your website, that's great, but you better be able to track how much additional revenue you're getting as a result of that logo so that you can directly say that this client is generating gross margin and net profit for me, or it's not. And if it's not, cut them loose and move on. Figure out how to fill that revenue with higher profit clients.
Yeah, unfortunately, I see they don't do that.
Oh no, they don't.
They go after, and some of them, that's their whole presumption is that they go after that client, they're going to be able to get that IP. They don't realize that that's not part of the negotiation process. So in the end, it's a total lose for them because they're not getting any sort of able to say this is a client. They're eating all the cost and they're producing all this work. It's baffling how. But it's sort of you bring up a really good point of like the operational agreement. That is one thing that I often help clients document a lot of the time because I've worked with clients who are just like, we haven't had time to really document and really come through with how our whole business operates day to day. Like we have some of it documented, but we've grown, we've shifted, and they are not, sometimes part of that is like they should be, measuring X to this, or they should be doing this to this. And they're no longer doing that anymore because it wasn't producing or wasn't as productive doing it the old way. But that's not been shifted and changed and actually added into their documentation. And so when they're looking to, sell to a company and they give them what they have, it's a totally different way of operating than what's provided to someone else. And when that happens, the person you're trying to sell to, they actually have higher negotiation power now because they're going in to do due diligence and notice what you give them is not aligned to it. So they have the ability to be like, we're going to give you a lower deal because you're not actually doing what you provided me, what you're doing. They can negotiate more to what they want to do. So it's really, I think, a lot with the smaller owners is really having what you said. I loved what you said. Exactly. Like having clarity of how you operate. Clear, precise clarity on how you operate is what is needed with a lot of the small businesses, and having it set up, documented, having people follow through with it, having the training and having the talks and negotiations with all of the partners, suppliers, all those contracts to make sure that you're doing that. That shifts the narrative and allows business owners to have so much more power at the negotiation table when they're thinking of exiting a business.
And one of the things I'm curious to get your thoughts on this, because I've seen a lot of small business owners kind of sit and they kind of live in a fantasy land of how they think things are done versus the reality of how things are actually getting done. How have you seen that unfold in the work that you do? And how do you get business owners to actually connect with the reality of what their business is versus what they think people should be doing?
I see it a lot more than I would like to admit, but
Mhm.
yeah, I see it a lot more. It's sort of a natural way of things when you've been running a company as an owner for a while and you've been doing more of the day to day. And then as you build the folks underneath you, they might see different ways to do things in the company
Mhm.
that actually benefit it more. But as an owner, because you're more, higher, dealing with more things, fighting fires, dealing with more other stuff, you may not get into some of the weeds of certain things. And
Mhm.
so a lot of the work I do is when trying to provide operational excellence within a company itself is to bring all parties together to have them understand exactly why certain things are being done and what the
Mm.
benefit of those things are. And sometimes in those conversations with both parties involved, we end up finding that, yes, this new way of doing it actually is better and is actually providing more operational efficiency for the company. Or we find the opposite where it's like, actually, no, this is causing more drag. Let's shift it and do this other way. And then we start to have more of a sort of an understanding of how we can shift it forward and how to be better growing across. Because there's certain things that a company wants to do. If an owner is deciding he wants to exit in about 5 years, and also too potentially he's looking at acquiring some assets to actually create a higher value within his company.
Right. Right.
If there's no clear idea of like how his company really is operating, and his team is operating in a different way, and
Mhm.
they decide to buy this other company to bring in to add higher value into the company so that when he exits in 5 to maybe 10 years,
Yeah.
that company increases in value, there's going to be a huge problem in actually determining if that company is actually the right one to bring in. Because
Mhm.
maybe how they're operating goes completely polar against how you're operating, but you'd have no clue because your team has shifted things around. And so it's really just when you are looking to do any kind of negotiation, it's sort of being clear where you stand first
Mm.
and foremost, I think is the most important aspect for owners in companies. Because for them to really understand, where does my company operate? What kind of contracts do I have? What kind of ways that I am doing my day to day? Who are my distributors? How am I taking my products from A to Z on a
Mhm.
daily basis? How are people functioning day to day? That's where you as an owner taking the time to do your own due diligence and how your business operates is really a way to give you way more leverage for whatever you're looking to do with your company. Because
I love that. Yes.
it's because what I find is that there's so much assumptions that people have of like, I assume this other company is going to be great, or I assume my son is going to be great taking over this company, or I assume that I can easily leave this company tomorrow and
Right.
make several billions of dollars and go live on an island. There's a lot of assumptions in place,
Mhm.
but there's no type of, well, this is your assumption, but is what the reality really matching your assumption? And that's where I
Mm.
find in operations, that's where the gap often lies. It's the assumption and the reality. There's a huge cavern. And where I come in is helping, you know, go through that cavern to really see what is actually down there. Because is
Mm.
it actually on target to your assumption? And if it's not, it's usually because there's something that's highly risky that is actually preventing it to go that way. And let's figure out how to fix that as soon as possible so that when you are in the negotiation table, you know exactly what you need. You can be able to negotiate efficiently. And this is where I find business owners who are trying to negotiate with the bigger public companies often that's where they get basically bad deals.
Mm. Yeah, I've seen that too. I mean, and big companies do this too. So let's make no mistake, this is not a small company phenomenon. It's not exclusive to smaller organizations. And I was negotiating with an oil and gas company. This was a number of years ago. They had a piece of software that was a very expensive piece of software, $10,000 per concurrent license. So concurrent license for folks is when more than one person can be accessing a license, but up to a certain limit, up to a certain number of licenses. And so they had like 600 licenses. and they had 1 week a year when they used more than 280 licenses. So they were paying for 600 licenses, and it was massively less expensive for them to actually pay the penalty for that 1 week of overage. But they'd never done the homework. They'd made assumptions. They'd never asked who is using this software and how are they using it? When are they using it? They had never done that basic operational analysis to get clarity on what they were doing. And so whether you're buying a company, whether you're buying a product, having or selling a product, and I talk a lot about how, when you're buying products, you need to know what your suppliers' costs are, right? You've got to know what your suppliers' costs are. But you've got to know what your costs are of using that product and everything about how you use it, why you use it, when you use it, all that. Because otherwise you go into all these things with assumptions. And then the person who has the more knowledge about what the reality is the person who is going to be more successful in the negotiation and be able to capture more value when you really want. And it also gives you the opportunity to find ways of creating additional value that you might not actually see if you're just looking at kind of what's right in front of you. So yeah, I agree with you 100% on that.
Yeah. And I find that, I agree with you that with bigger companies, they do have these challenges, but they have the ability to absorb the risk.
That's correct. That is the difference.
That's the biggest difference.
Yeah.
These smaller companies, they don't have the ability. It can make the company go out of business.
Right.
Very quickly. And that's where I think where there's the biggest difference between, coming from a world where I work with public companies and helping them figure out how to operate. Like I saw just multi-million dollars of losses a day just from small little things that they weren't doing operational wise. They would every day, one thing I worked on, it was $1 million a day that they were losing every day because there was a certain risk that they weren't fixing. But because the company was so big, they could absorb that to a certain amount of time and then fix it. That is something that for smaller companies could be detrimental, for losing $1 million a day. And I think that's one of the things that I find with smaller companies, they don't realize how much of money they're leaving on the table and how they are operating day to day, that it doesn't even affect the how they look to exit and what they do to that end game. It's when working with them and helping them understand, okay, these are the risks that you have in your company right now of how you're operating. I've worked with companies where we fixed this risk within a year. It took the value of the company and their profits and actually doubled and tripled it, just by removing that risk. Right. And so that's where the biggest thing is, that I think for a lot of companies, how you operate kind of seems for granted sometimes, because it's sort of the everyday, you got to do it, got to get up, got to deal with the clients, got to put the stuff in, got to, but it's even those things that are day to day and simple, you probably see it often in negotiations. It's like those simple, small negotiations, those could be the ones that end up giving you the bigger value, the bigger income than you realize. And it isn't, you're not looking at sort of the nitty-gritty details on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's very consistent with my observation as well, and what I see. And I think you and I both do what we do because that's something that we just really want to help smaller organizations change. A thing I love about you and me as well is that we're very bottom line focused. It's like, what's the bottom line, right? And we appreciate the revenue, we appreciate the sales, but it's not the revenue that's going to drive our business to longevity or growth. It's the profit that's going to drive us to be successful. That's what we need to carry us forward. And so you and I have that common passion about profit. How do we make sure we're doing something that's profitable?
Yeah, because it's for me, I look at it as that's really the value. And I love working with the smaller companies because you brought up great. It was passion, like their
Mm,
passion of what they're doing. I love that. And I love seeing good people make a lot of money. That's like my personal
mm,
life mission of life. You know,
love it.
I felt like I worked in a lot of big corporate companies and helped people who were not necessarily the nicest people make a lot of money. And when I started working with private companies, like these are good people. Like they're mom and pops, some of them like first generation immigrants, multi-generation
Yeah.
immigrants. Like these are, salt of the earth type of people. Like I love the folks that I work with, and
Mhm,
their passion of what they're bringing into the world. And so
mhm,
one of the things it's sort of helping them understand is that like your passion equates a value that your customers are loving and excited to have, but the problem
mhm.
is that you are devaluing yourself and your company
Mm,
by the way that you're operating in this fashion. And so it's
right.
not to your negotiation, it's not a win-win in how you are doing
Mm,
business. Your customers are winning, but you are actually losing. And even
right.
though you're thinking you're getting a great revenue, the profits that you're getting are not equal to what you're giving out to the world.
Right.
So that's where it's like helping these smaller businesses and smaller companies and privately held companies really just increase the value that they get themselves,
Mhm,
um, equates to actually making more revenue
right.
much easier.
Yes.
That is
Uh,
what they don't realize. They're so
Yeah.
focused on like that revenue, but it's like if you focus more on the value, the revenue will like quadruple quickly.
Right. So we're about to come to a close. So when you think about kind of all the things that we talked about, kind of what are three things that you think that any business owner needs to know in order to move their business forward from a negotiation perspective, exit planning, operational efficiency perspective? What are two or three of the kind of the big things that you think they need to know?
I think number one is being very clear on how you operate. Getting into the weeds, getting clear, documenting it, and coming from a perspective of just this is how you are operating, clean
Hmm.
and simple. Just know where you're starting from. I think is the number one thing owners require to do, especially if they're thinking of doing some sort of exit planning. No matter what time frame they're looking
Hmm.
at, I think that is the number one thing they really should
Okay,
start to do.
got it.
And then number two is that once you have an understanding of like how you really operate, what are ways to remove the risk in your operations? That is the
Mm,
second thing I think that is these are probably the top two things business owners to really focus on, because if they're able to focus on how you operate and how to remove the risk, your ability to create a succession and exit plan that is going to benefit you in 10 times over
mhm.
after you exit the company, and those assumptions that you want for exiting, that's going to make that possible. And so I think that's really what it comes down to for business owners, is really understand, get clear on how you are operating and remove the risk, because
Mm,
those are things that when you go to a negotiation table, that you know how you operate and you've got risks, and you actually can say and share like, we do have these risks in these companies and we are working on fixing these risks right away. That does increase the value of how you look to a potential
mm,
buyer of a company.
absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
it's really just sort of doing your homework as a business owner of like what's going on in this business, because this is your baby, this is your passion,
Mhm.
but you want to know, how's check in with the baby, see how
Yeah.
they're doing.
What's real and what's in my imagination kind of
Exactly.
thing. That's fantastic. So I love that. And what you just said is like, that's negotiation. I mean, that's like, know what you want, be clear on what it is, how you're doing your business. And that defines what you want. So once you have that clarity, and then managing risk, that's like, that's what a negotiation is all about. Is negotiating is a conversation. I always say negotiation is nothing more than a conversation about a relationship. And you can't win a relationship. You use negotiation as a way of managing that relationship, reducing risk, sharing in risk, and evolving together. And so that so thank you for that. I love that. So how can people find you?
People can find me. They can find me on my website, which is jenveyconsulting.com. You can check in with me on all the services that my company offers. And, that's a great way to really connect with me. And also you can find me on LinkedIn. Look me up as Livia Jenvey on LinkedIn, and you can also find me there.
Awesome. Thank you so much. It's been an honor to have you here. And to the audience, thank you so much for staying with us today. It is just always an honor to serve you, and just really look forward to having you here with us next time. Check out vennegotiation.com for information about me, about what we do at Venn Negotiation, here to help you as small business owners elevate your negotiation, get more of what you ask for and more of what you want. Thank you very much. And Livia, thank you again. And everyone have an awesome day. And we'll see you next time on In the Venn Zone. Cheers.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of In the Venn Zone with Christine McKay. We invite you to visit our website at www.venn.zone to access the show notes and other helpful resources. Empower the negotiator in you and successfully level the playing field. Join us again next time here on In the Venn Zone.